Hi, you're listening to the Fresh Start podcast, and this is episode number 32. Hello, friends. Welcome to the Fresh Start podcast. This is Marcia, and I'm here alone today because Stacy has a very sick puppy. She's taking care of her sweet Lana today and taking her to the vet and getting some tests run. So you guys send up some prayers and love and hugs out to Stacy and Lana today. Stacy, we miss you, and we hope Lana gets better soon. So she'll be back soon. But we have a great guest today, and I'm not going to talk long because I want to get right to this really awesome conversation. Our guest today is Pastor Stan Mitchell. I'll tell you a little bit about him in a minute before we get into our conversation with him. But before we get into that, I do have one little bit of, what do you call it? News. I have news for you. With God and My Girlfriend's Ministries, which sponsors this podcast, we are going to have a summer book club. So all you book lovers, y'all need to join us. We are going to be reading, ta-da, if you're watching me on YouTube, you can see the book. It's Joyful Anyway by Kate Bowler. I love Kate Bowler. She is so funny and so smart. If you're not familiar with Kate, she is a historian. And she, I'm just going to look here at her bio, Sarah. So she's the 4-time New York Times bestselling author of Everything Happens for a Reason, No Cure for Being Human, Good Enough, The Lives We Actually Have a Beautiful, Terrible Day, Blessed, and The Preacher's Wife. She hosts the popular podcast Everything Happens and writes the Substack of the same name. She's a Duke University professor, and she earned a master's of religion from Yale Divinity School and a PhD at Duke University. So, like I said, she's super smart, but she's also super funny, and she's a super great writer. And several of the girls with God and My Girlfriends here in Nashville did a little outing together and saw Kate Bowler live at the Fisher Center here on Belmont University. And she talked about her book and told us other stories, and she was just delightful. And so we're going to do her book as a book club this summer. We're starting on July the 8th. We'll meet for 6 weeks every Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Central, 5 p.m. Pacific. So if you could join us, we would love it. If you would, you can get the book anywhere. But if you would like a free book, here's where we go off the grid. If you would like a free book, not just a free book, an autographed copy, I have one. If you'll do me a favor, if you'll do me a solid, we need some more reviews on our podcast, rating and reviews over on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, or wherever you listen. So first person that goes and leaves us a wonderful 5-star rating and a raving review, send me a screenshot of it, and I will send you this free copy of Joyful Anyway, autographed copy. You want this book, whether you can join us or not. I hope you will, but whether you're or not, you're going to love this book. So that's that. One other thing. Our next episode is something you guys have been asking for. It's going to be all about the Enneagram. Stacy is an Enneagram coach. She knows all the stuff. And we have a special guest that's coming on. My sister, Lori, is going to come on, and she just got her Enneagram chart done. And Stacy's going to go over it with her live here on the air. And we're going to talk about all the numbers, everything Enneagram. We're going to answer all your questions. So if you have a specific question about the Enneagram and you want to email us at freshstartpod2025@gmail.com, send me your questions. Send us your questions, and we'll try to answer those on the next episode, which will be coming in a couple of weeks. Today, we have a super special guest and someone that I was really excited about getting to talk to. Stan Mitchell. I have gotten to know him a little bit because of the church that I've been attending, Grace Point Community Church here in Nashville. And he speaks sometimes at our church. But every time he speaks, I tell him in the interview, I cry because he has some amazing stories. And I just knew I wanted him to come on and tell about the awesome work that he's doing. This is June, this is Pride Month, and he works with so many families that have LGBTQ children or other members in the families and help them sort of rectify faith and becoming inclusive. And because most people that I know really want to, but they struggle to get over that hump because of what they've been taught. And Stan's going to really walk us through a lot of that today. So y'all are going to want to stay tuned. Let me tell you just a little bit about Stan. Stan Mitchell is currently the teaching pastor at the Village in Atlanta, Georgia, at Austin New Church in Texas, the Well in Phoenix, Arizona, Harvest Sarasota in Florida, the Grove in Bryson City, North Carolina, and Pine Street Church in Boulder, Colorado. He's a busy man. He is the pastor emeritus of Grace Point Church in Nashville, Tennessee, having served as its lead pastor from its inception in 2003 through 2019. And Stan, we talk a lot about this in our interview today about the progression of Grace Point, because in 2015, Grace Point made the move to the full affirmation and celebration of LGBTQ people. He now spends his vocational time as a pastor, speaker, LGBTQ plus advocate, and consultant within the progressive Christian movement. He's a graduate of Vanderbilt Divinity School, so he's super smart too. Anyway, I know you're going to love this conversation. It's an important one. So y'all stick around and we will be right back with Stan Mitchell.
Well, welcome everybody back to the Fresh Start podcast. This is Stacy Wynn. It's nice to have you here today, and I am joined by Marcia. Marcia, hello.
Hi.
How are you?
Happy to be here.
And we have a special guest today. We've got Stan Mitchell in the house. Welcome, Stan.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, Stan, I'm so happy to have you here. I've been attending Grace Point, where you're the founding pastor. We already read your bio, and it has been a godsend to me. Even though I met with Josh, our current pastor, you're the founding pastor, but our current teaching pastor, Josh Scott, who's awesome and was on our podcast a few episodes ago talking about his new book, Bible Stories for Grownups, which is great. And I admitted to Josh, I said, it's taken me a long time. I've been sort of like tiptoeing in, and then I tiptoe back out, and I'm just not sure, which way to go. But it has been such a godsend, and I always love it when you're there. You have so much valuable information. I love your heart. I always cry at some point when you're there, because you have such amazing stories. But speaking of stories, can we just start? We just found out we're both Arkansans. I grew up in Arkadelphia and you're in Paragould. But can you talk a little bit about your growing up and your background, and how did you even become a pastor?
So I grew up in a wonderful family. My dad was the 12th of 15 kids. And I think there are 47 of us first cousins. And then a host of great aunts, and mom's side was a big side. Both sides of my family were Pentecostal. I grew up 5 generations deep in a Wesleyan Pentecostal tradition, a holiness tradition. Women couldn't cut their hair.
Oh, wow.
Little boys and girls like I was, we were not allowed to play Little League Baseball because it was considered a worldly amusement. So
oh my gosh.
it was incredibly high demand. They were wonderful people. I don't look back with memories of hypocrisy and spiritual torture. I look back fondly, remembering people who were, I think, for the most part, doing the best they could with the information they had and the location they were. And so I talk about those early days as being, contaminated water, and there's dissonance in that, because there was water there that was hydrating me spiritually and making me alive, and simultaneously the water was making me sick, and both were true.
Wow.
And untangling that, is quite a process. But I grew up in that world, of that world is famous for kid preachers. If a young male shows any zeal, any capacity at all, they're going to be conscripted into ministry. So by the time I was 16, I was a child star preacher and driving around the country and preaching revivals and
Oh my gosh.
helping people know the deep things of God at 16 years old. So that's the world that I grew up in.
Wow. But you obviously you had a quite a journey going from that to where you are now.
Right.
So can you talk a little bit about
Sure.
that journey?
It happened in gradations. I was a kid with a pretty acute conscience. I had I think some people's psyches are like Teflon for religious shame. If theirs is Teflon, mine was Velcro. I was the kid on the front row that absorbed it all, took it all in. So because I had such an acute conscience and such a religious scrupulosity, the move from there to here has happened in gradations, and I could name 7 or 8 of them where I moved as far as I could, stretched as far as I could, fearful that my stretching was heresy and backsliding and apostasy, but feeling like it was being drawn and growing. But I would stretch as far as I could, and then I would abide there a while. Every group I left said my stretching was heresy. Every group that welcomed me said I was growing in Christ until I outgrew them. And when I would leave them, then it would become a new heresy. But part of our high demand holiness tradition in the Pentecostal church was we were also very exclusivistic. We were a restorationist group that took Christianity's exclusive tone to the nth degree. We did not recognize, not only did we not recognize Hindus and Buddhists and Muslims, we didn't recognize Catholics and Mormons. We didn't recognize other Protestants. Our group didn't even recognize other Pentecostals, other denominations like the Assembly of God, Pentecostal Holiness Church of God. We did not recognize them. We were so exclusivistic. We really believed that we were the only Christians, and we weren't even sure about ourselves, actually. We eventually began to cannibalize our own souls with that exclusivistic tone. And so our elderly people, most of the ones that I knew, lived with a real angst about the afterlife and death. After all of those years of serving the Lord, there was always this kind of plaintive cry in their testimony to please pray for me that I make it. And most of our elderly didn't die with a great sense of peace, looking forward to whatever's in the next world. They died hoping. So we didn't really believe that our denomination were the only Christians. We believed there was a remnant within our denomination that only God would tease out at judgment. So that's how exclusivistic. And so these days, I'm known for my work with LGBTQ inclusion in religious settings, especially the Christian church. But my journey with exclusion inclusion started a long time before,
Hmm.
not particular to any sexual or gender issue or specific topic, but more just I began to really find morally and spiritually untenable for me the idea that people were born um, separated from God and in need of a salvific reunion, and that there was one little group somewhere, even if it was the large group of Christianity, that had the answer to vouchsafing people's afterlife. That's where it started for me. But it started with people like Billy Graham. I mean, our group didn't believe Billy Graham was saved.
Oh,
Um, Within
wow.
our family, we were very separated. We were in different portions of the Pentecostal church. And I remember as a child when aunts or uncles that weren't specifically in our church would die, and I would have to face terrible, this terrible idea that these beloved aunts and uncles of mine were lost now and going to hell. And it was those things as a 10, 11, 12-year-old child that really began to push on the borders of this very concretized doctrine that I'd grown up in. So
Hmm.
when I was 16 and I was preaching, a Methodist neighbor lady unwittingly, not knowing that I had signed an ordination covenant that I would not read external literature. We were not supposed to read outside of our denominational writings.
Wow.
And but she gave me a Max Lucado book, popular evangelical author. This was 1984. And because I had agreed to not read that kind of literature, I put it under my bed. But for whatever reason, after a year or so, I finally pulled it out and read it, and I was scandalized because I just could not imagine that someone who was Church of Christ, another type of Protestant evangelical, I couldn't imagine, because we knew they were lost. We knew they weren't God's people. But I just couldn't imagine how he could write so articulately and movingly about Jesus. And that started a journey for me. I can't remember, George Bernard Shaw may have been the author of this saying, but yeah, it was Shaw that said, a mind once exposed to a better idea can never shrink to its original size.
Mm.
And that journey, I will say, from 16 to about 30, as a young minister in evangelical settings, I am a cishet person, but I was very closeted theologically. And what I found with Licato was, if you really want to know what high demand religious authors think, don't read what they write, read who they read. And I figured out pretty quickly in the bibliographies of all of these authors that they were reading beyond them. They were reading people who were provocateurs, but were, beyond their setting. And I literally bibliographied my way upstream through these people's writings and their readings, and my mind just kept growing. And that played out in 8 or 9 iterations. By the time I was 30, I was definitively Christian in the most progressive, wide-hearted sense of that word, but very interfaith. I have every sense that religion deserves a place in the world as philosophical poetry, as a wisdom tradition, but I don't think we need salvific religions that are demanding of people the acquiescence that they're lost and in need of some kind of spiritual repair so they don't burn forever and they get to live in an eternal Beverly Hills. That idea I moved away from and started Grace Point, where you are now, in 2003, and started Grace Point literally a la Harriet Tubman, to be a bit of an underground railroad. It's built contiguous to the Christian world of high demand religion. The stylings were similar, so it would be comfortable in its affect. But we built it originally to be a deconstruction zone where people from Mormon, Orthodox, Catholic, Protestant, evangelical backgrounds could come and literally fall apart safely. And did that for 10 years, and those were halcyon days, and it grew and grew and grew. And then Obergefell and same gender marriage came along, and that really pushed us into another zone where we had to be more definitive about what we believed and not just curate a space for people to fall apart, but to say, no, a lot of the people there, we probably grew at that time 2,500 to 3,000 members, 400 to 500 of which were queer people.
Wow.
And
So
I
you were
knew,
inclusive right from the start?
so we were practically inclusive, but not technically. We never talked about issues. We literally curated a deconstruction zone.
Gotcha.
But when Obergefell came out, I knew that now all of these LGBTQ people were going to be asking me to marry them, and I knew I couldn't say no. So that kind of thrust us into a new chapter. I'll put a pin in it and stop there. I'm sure there.
You're heading in the right direction. So.
Am I?
Yeah, you are. You are. And, we're interested in hearing more about what it means to be inclusive. And this particular month that we're recording and releasing this podcast, we're in Pride Month. So, and also more specifically, what was it like when you had to become purposefully inclusive to the queer community? How did that look and feel to the people who were in your church, but you needed to be more kind of black and white about it?
No, that was 2012. And again, we were 9 years old at the time, had built a campus, and we were well known as a gadfly in the community. Mainline liberal denominations didn't know what to do with us because we weren't a part of them. We looked evangelical in our stylings, and of course, evangelicals could listen to us and know that we weren't saying what they were saying. But with all of that said, our folk were very comfortable in that space of just curating a deconstruction. If you would have asked me, Stacy, back then, hey, how does Grace Point feel about abortion or substitutionary penal atonement? I would have literally said, not coy, but I would have said, honestly, I don't know. You'll have to ask them. Because we weren't a church that had a definitive statement of faith. That wasn't our point. It was a place, if we had 800 people on Sunday morning, we'd have 600 to 800 in book clubs during the week. And they were reading Tony Campolo and Brian McLaren and Rob Bell and Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan and, all of the liberal authors. So that's what we were. But in that process, with the Obergefell decision, one of our members was a well-known country music personality, and they were asked, well, I think they were in Britain, but they were asked by a reporter, maybe a BBC reporter, how they felt about the idea of same-gender marriage. And I think the reporter there had some sense of the fact that the Dixie Chicks, also country stars, had effectively lost or had a great blow to their career sometime before by saying something about a Republican president, George W. Bush. Country music perennially has a pretty conservative milieu or audience. And so the reporter asked our member, how do you feel about this? I know you have a very conservative audience, but you seem like a forward-thinking person. And as best I can remember, she said something pretty innocuous. She said, well, I think love is love. And the reporter pushed further and said, well, I know you are a Christian. You attend a Christian church. And she said, well, I know my pastor is personally inclusive and would marry gay people. Well, that was 2011. That was 2012. And by the time that got back across the Atlantic, Westboro Baptist decided to come picket us that week. And the Wall Street Journal called and different ones called because we were a post-evangelical church in the middle of the Bible Belt. And we were different, obviously. And so they called in relation, and it created quite a furor. And, you have to remember at that time, even Barack Obama was not affirming same gender marriage. He was affirming civil union. He was equivocating. So even though we know that we've kind of backtread a little bit recently, we are further down the road than we were in 2011 because it's mind-boggling that Barack Obama wasn't even at that time affirming. So that week, I pretty quickly realized that our church was divided into three groups. There was a third of the church, and it was pretty much a third, and a third. A third of the church were definitively progressive Christians who knew exactly what I was saying. They had deconstructed, they had reconstructed a spirituality that worked for them very well. And so when they heard that Grace Point's pastor would marry gay people, per our member, they were like, well, sure. Who thought that he wouldn't? And then there was a third of the church who were in that middle ground of deconstruction. And these were nail-biting, white-knuckling Southern Baptist Church of Christ, Assembly of God, Presbyterian, who were safely deconstructing, but to hear their pastor would do something, that clearly, for some of them, it pulled them forward. For some of them, they were like, oh, that's too far. That's too far. And then there was a third of the church, and this is the interesting third. There was a third of the church that were probably the people closest to me because I had known them the longest, and they were definitively conservative, traditional, Orthodox Christians who loved me. They loved the location. They loved our style. They listened to the same sermon that the liberals listened to and got what they wanted to get out of it. And I had learned to speak in a way that all three groups could interpret me safely. And I don't think that was a political move on my part as much as I was trying to be discreet and just maintain this deconstruction zone.
Yeah.
But once I recognized those three groups, because those three groups, they were on the board together, they were in our staff together, they were in the choir together, they were teaching Sunday school together, they were in life groups, and now all of a sudden they were saying to one another as friends, hey, did you hear what they said about Stan? And the person would respond, "Sure did. Isn't that great?" And they're like, "What do you mean great? Stan doesn't believe that." And the other person would say, "What Stan are you talking about? Of course he does." So I
You,
knew I had a mess. I
you had
knew
them
I
all
had a mess.
confused.
I had a mess. It had been great for 9 years.
Oh
So
man.
I, instead of standing up and saying, "Okay, this is what we've been doing," and yes, I am definitively a a liberal Christian to the nth degree, a liberal religionist to the nth degree. I've been curating this zone, but I will be marrying Mary and Jody if they ask me to marry them. I can't. This is not a question for me. I can't say no in good conscience. I'd lose my soul, whatever that would mean. So instead of standing up and just doing that and the church bleeding out on the table, I stood up the next Sunday and I said, "Would you be willing to go into a period of discernment on this issue? Would you spend a year or two where all we do is we just discuss this issue? We pray, we listen to experts, we do sermon series, book clubs. Let's do a period of discernment." We lost about 500 people immediately just on the grounds of reviewing the subject.
Mm.
And then over the course of the year, as we got into the subject, we lost another 500 or so people just in discussion because they didn't believe the discussion was worthy, of place, that was such a fixed thing. And then at the end of 2 years, long story short, 2.5 years, um, I performed my first same gender wedding, and the masses continued to leave. That was December of 14, made the announcement in January 2015. Spent 4 years stabilizing Grace Point, building it back to a place, and moved to founding pastor. And that's when Josh came in 2019. Josh was a young man that came to me a few years before. He was pastoring an evangelical church in rural Kentucky, came to me and said, "Me too," and led that church in rural Kentucky, a former Southern Baptist church, to full inclusion.
Wow.
So
Good for
Josh
him.
took my place, and I'm still very involved, as you said, Marcia. But
Yeah.
that was Grace Point's journey in a nutshell to inclusion.
Well, so how did I grew up Southern Baptist and we were taught the same thing. Like we were the only ones that had it right. And then I married my first husband who was Church of Christ, and I had to become Church of Christ because his family wouldn't have it any other way. I even had to get rebaptized because they said my baptism into the Baptist church didn't count. So they made me get rebaptized. And they were telling me, no, we're the only ones that have it right. So now I'm so confused between what I was raised believing and then what now my new church is telling me, and ended up kind of leaving all of that, going to like a non-denominational for a while. There were some issues there. I started thinking, okay, maybe, they say maybe it's not you, it's me. I don't know. I was like, maybe I'm just like looking for this perfect church that was never going to be found. Then I dug in one more time to a church, and it was the moment that I left the church was because the Sunday school teacher was posting something on her Facebook page. It was that big meme that said, "You can be gay and you can be a Christian, but there's no such thing as a gay Christian." And I said, "I'm out." That was like, I was done. And I just couldn't understand why this LGBTQ issue had become so central in evangelicals' world. Like, why was that the line? How did that become? I mean, there's like abortion is a line, I guess, and LGBT, but they picked these certain topics, right? That is just their line in the sand. What's your take on that? Like, why did they pick that as a line?
Gosh, I think there are multiple reasons for that, not the least of which is the fact that all humans, I think, psychically carry some sense of uneasiness about our worth, about our identity, about our value. I don't know that that's intrinsic. Um, Social biologists and anthropologists could speak to that. But I do know by the time a child is 4 or 5 years old, they know per the social structure that there's a caste system, and there's a lot of personal worth issues for all of us. I think we carry that deep in our psyche or our soul, and I think it manifests in our body. I think as someone who's raised a 27-year-old now and a 20-year-old daughter, 27-year-old son, 20-year-old daughter, particularly my 20-year-old daughter, watching the journey of a young woman through the first 20 years of her life, um, social media and comparison, the toxicity. I think that sense of shame or not enoughness or insufficiency that we carry in us, it obviously manifests in our body. And I think it particularly manifests in our sexuality. I just think physiologically, there are more, to be frank, there are more nerve endings per square millimeter in those places, not just physiologically, but psychologically. There is such tenderness there. And this part of our being that connects us so intimately with another person. In the original Hebrew story, um, it's such a brilliant piece of wisdom literature because Adam and Eve saw the fruit with their eyes, picked it with their hands, ate it with their mouth, digested it with their belly. But when the sense of shame hit them, what did they cover? They covered their loins, they covered their sexual parts. They hadn't even made a mistake with their sexual parts, but they were originally described in their pristine state as naked and not ashamed, which is so interesting. I mean, Christianity's first 2,000 years would have suspected that they were described as naked and not sinful because the big deal about being naked is to not sin.
Right.
And yet, when the original author said they are unscathed and perfect in their soul, how can I say that? They have a capacity to be naked without a sense of insufficiency, without scanning their body and feeling less than. They were naked and not ashamed. And then on the other side of what we call the fall, they weren't described as naked and sinful. Now they were naked and ashamed. And that shame localized in their loins, in their sexuality. And I just think it makes sense to me that it's such a tender area of our life that we carry a lot of insecurities there. And one thing we know that humans do with our insecurities and our insufficiencies is we scapegoat. We find marginalized minority groups and individuals that we can somehow set in our mind as worse than us. And it sounds like we're saying when we scapegoat LGBTQ people or divorcees or whoever it sounds like we're saying, take your sin and get away from us. What we're actually psychically doing is foisting our own shame onto them and telling them to take our shame away from us so we can feel better. And
Wow.
we have perennially done that with minority groups because they are easier to pick on, and this is a minority group. So I think there's a social, there's a social aspect, but there's also the reality of my own projection.
Mhm.
And so I work with families, with queer family members intensely, and I've been doing this now for the last 10 years. And what I just described, I see anecdotally play out every day.
Wow.
So, the name of our podcast is Fresh Start. And we talk about that in many different ways. You just took us on a journey about just seeing things from new perspectives. How do you, when you're in those conversations with people or you're in conversations with pockets of people in your church, even, what is the way that you start to see things more clearly? How do you help people
Well,
do that?
I one thing I build bridges, I don't burn them. And I know when I walk into a home where there's an Assembly of God pastor and his wife that have a 19-year-old queer child, I know that intersection is cataclysmic. I know there is such dissonance that, I mean, that often the child doesn't want to live the parents are deeply afraid that their child is going to be lost for eternity. And I don't walk into those situations assuming the worst about the rejecting family member, because I have been that person. I don't have to look any further than my story. Stacy, I didn't change my heart toward queer people. I changed my mind about God.
Mm.
I loved gay people when I thought it was a sin. I love gay people now that I don't think it's a sin. I think it is way oversimplifying and missing the point for people like me to walk into those situations and say, well, you just need to love your spouse or your child or your sibling. They do love their family member. They love them deeply. Their problem is not their heart toward their family member in most cases, it's their mind about scripture and God. These are people who feel duty bound to God, and their love for their child makes them honor scripture because they think this is what's best for their child. So I know in those settings, and this is probably what makes me adept at what I do, I not only carry a great sympathy for the queer people who are being abused by these religious ideas, I carry sympathy for the people who are the perpetrators, because this really is the intersection of two wounds. And long before Grace Point became principally involved in LGBTQ inclusion, we were actually helping the first group, the wounded perpetrators who were carrying awful ideas about God. And so I know that I'm dealing with acute consciences. I know that I white knuckled my way through every stage of deconstruction. And so it would be incredibly callous of me, after taking years to do my own deconstruction and white knuckle and angstily move my way to a broader vision of God, for me to go in and demand of people to turn on a dime. So as long as people are showing an openness, again, I don't go in and say, you need to love your child or you need to love your sibling. I go in and say, I know you love your child. And on the grounds of that love, I'm not asking you to change your heart toward your kid. I'm asking you, would you be willing, based on their suffering and your love for them, to revisit an issue? Because the Christian church, even in the most conservative understanding, the Christian church has a long history of getting some things terribly wrong and being corrected by spirit, apologizing, making reparations, and getting things right. We started out as a church 2,000 years ago denying entrance to Gentile people, which was 99% of the world's population. So we have long had a history of getting things wrong and being corrected. So those are the grounds that I go in. I'm just asking people to be willing to revisit a tender subject.
Mm. You know, you were talking about when Grace Point, when you ask people just to spend a year on discernment on this issue, and people left. They didn't even want to have that curiosity. They didn't want to even have these conversations because they were so dug in. And we were talking last week on the podcast with our friend Melissa, and she was kind of saying the same thing you are. She was like, the people that she knows that are still not affirming for LGBTQ people, a lot of those people, she doesn't look at them as nefarious. She doesn't look at them as unloving or unkind. They just have been taught that there's a right and a wrong in this issue, and they believe so deeply. They actually care. They don't want their people to go to hell, because that is so ingrained in their teaching. And it kind of goes back to that exclusivity issue where just Christianity in general, each little pocket, and what are there, like 10,000 sects of Christianity? And some of them are more open to, maybe we're not the only ones that have it right, but some of them will double down and say, no, this is the only way. And they're so afraid of going to hell or their loved ones going to hell that they just can't even give this issue more thought. How do you get over that hump?
Yeah, what you're pointing to is what Josh and I talked about a couple of weeks ago in our conversation. I I personally believe that it's not just evangelicalism or Mormonism or Catholicism or high demand versions of Christianity. I think Christianity writ large, and even religion writ large, has a comeuppance here. I personally think the fundamental problem here is the idea that any human can have a measure of certainty about invisible things like God and the afterlife. See, religions like Christianity assume, number one, that there is a creator. Okay, I can go with that. Although I don't believe you can prove that either way, frankly.
Yeah.
I don't I am a reverent Christian agnostic, because agnosticism is not atheism light. It is simply the admission that I don't know.
Mm.
And I personally believe that we can't know. But many religions believe that you can know, and Christianity has assumed that you can know because it goes beyond there is a God to that God discloses themselves or reveals themselves to creation. So that's the second assumption. And I think it's a tenable assumption, again, unprovable and very anecdotal, because when people begin trying to prove that they know for a fact that God has disclosed himself to us, they tell stories that are wildly contradictory. But the third piece is the really damaging part, and that is, not only is there a God, not only does that God disclose himself, here's the problem. Not only is there a God, and not only has that God disclosed himself, but that God has disclosed himself exclusively to us. And our group has been the harbingers of a communication that is sacrosanct, and you have to listen to us and believe that we are the group that has the distinct exclusive message from the divine. Now, that becomes incredibly challenging when those groups begin to multiply. The religious enterprise begin to multiply quickly, and all of a sudden dozens turn into hundreds, and hundreds turn into thousands and tens of thousands of disparate groups. I mean, there is, the Indus Valley produces Hinduism, Buddhism, and then the Abrahamic religions, and the Abrahamic religions produce Judaism and Islam and Christianity. And then Christianity produces Catholicism and Orthodoxy and Protestantism and the LDS Mormonism, and then Protestantism produces the evangelicals, and the evangelicals produce Baptist and Assembly of God and Church of God and Church of Christ and Nazarene and Presbyterian have multiple forms. And each of those groups are saying, we are the group that has the insurance plan from God for the afterlife. And not only do we have an insurance plan that will work for your afterlife, our insurance is the only insurance that will work. Now, here's the problem. I don't even know how to explain how intellectually untenable that seems to me. But it's more problematic than that. I left those ideas when they become intellectually untenable and irrational. But I have resolved to continue the work to help heal the damage done by those things, because I believe those ideas that I just described, that's not just intellectually untenable, that's morally untenable. Because what we are doing to queer people, we are looking at a queer 11-year-old child and saying, you are fundamentally at odds with God. And the child says, why? And we say, because of something intrinsic to you, like your sexuality or gender. So it's your sexuality. So this way that you are going to intimately connect with another human who might be a life partner and have a beautiful experience with them, that part of you that is natural to you, that is one of the most beautiful parts of your life, fundamentally puts you at odds with God. Well, that's spiritual terrorism in the psyche of an 11-year-old child.
Yes.
But we're not just doing that to 11-year-old queer children. Christianity's first couple of thousand years, the dominant view has us doing that to every child who's ever been born.
Mm-hmm.
We tell every child who ever has been born, you are at odds with God innately, intrinsically, inherently, at birth. Why? Not even your gender or sexuality, just because you are you. You are born fundamentally flawed, in need of salvific repair. And so what we're doing to queer people is just the tip of the spear. It's the tip of the iceberg. We have got to trace this back to the fundamental issue. And the fundamental issue, no religion deserves to stand up and say, God has clearly communicated to us, you have to listen to us. And if you don't, your eternal consequence is in jeopardy. Christianity has got to evolve out of that idea, or humanity's got to evolve out of Christianity. Can I get any plainer than how I feel?
Fear is a motivating factor. I mean, that
Yep.
whole fear of going to hell.
And that's the strength of fear-based religion. I can't prove that it's not true. You see, fear-based religion works on the insurance algorithm. We all, sitting here as adults, spend $10,000 to $20,000 a year, some of us, on insurances we don't plan on ever using. But you know why we have insurance? Because we can't afford the catastrophic. So we figure out a reasonable monthly premium and deductible that we can just barely handle, because there are catastrophic things that we can't. And when human beings developed the psychological capacity 5,000 to 10,000 years ago to really reflect on death and the afterlife and the invisible world, we could not, and we still can't, come up with certainty about what happens after we die. And we're not going to come up with that certainty. I really don't believe that. We can't come up with certainty about who is in the invisible world. And in the absence of certainty, humans have a tendency to prepare for the worst and hope for the best. And so we have built out an ultimate catastrophe of burning forever, separated from family, with the capacity to still see heaven and other people celebrate. We have built the most catastrophic thing. As a 5-year-old child, I knew that I was in jeopardy of burning forever. Well, the people that I work with continually have paroxysms of anxiety, and as they're moving down this road of deconstruction, they will erupt at times and say, "But how can you be sure?" And that's just it. You can't. I cannot prove that there's not a hell. I cannot prove that these things aren't true. So in the absence of that, people choose insurance. Here's the problem with the insurance model. Which insurance company are you going to use? You're going to use the Christian? Okay, which one? Oh, the Protestant? Which one? The Presbyterian? Which one? The EPC, the PCA, the PCUSA? Which one? See, so every human has this untenable reality of they have to be the ultimate expert and pick between 400 variations of Baptist if they settle on Baptist. If that's who God is, that is our worst nightmare. And I'm going to use some frank theological language right now. If that's who God is, we're all screwed anyway. And I just cannot imagine that that's who God is. And if it does turn out to be who God is, and the Jehovah's Witness or the Pentecostals or the Catholics or the Mormons or the Muslims, if one group is right and the rest are out, I think the hottest flame of hell for me will be disappointment. That something as beautiful, all of this, could have had someone that awful at the base of it. And I just don't have great fear that that's going to be the discovery one day. There's too much beauty here.
Yeah.
And I was just talking to my dad the other day, who's still a very conservative Christian. And I looked at him, Marcia, and I said, "Dad, if God turns out to be as third a good a person as you are, everybody will be fine." And he said, "Well, son, God's different." And I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "God's love's different than our love." And he said, "You talk about how I love." And he said, "But God's different. You can't hold." I said, "That's not what Jesus said." One day, Jesus was talking to religious leaders who had the same ideas about God that you have. And it so exasperated him. He didn't turn toward the temple and he didn't turn toward the heaven. He looked into their homes. He looked at those ministers and said, "If your child asks you for a piece of fish, would you give them a serpent? If they ask you for bread, would you give?" And I told my dad, I said, "Dad, he appealed to the way these religious leaders love their own children and said, that's how you can know who God is. God is at least that and more. So God's love is not different than human love. Even Jesus said that. Human love points to a love that's not less than ours, but even greater. And that's what I have deeply come to believe. And I just simply can't believe the other anymore. And so I spend my life now helping LGBTQ people, but the gender and sexuality issue is just the beginning, because when the tapestry begins to unravel around that one thread, other things become entangled, and that then leads them to the slippery slope. And I tell them all the time, you're going to get on a slippery slope. I've been on a slippery slope my whole life. I have slid right into the arms of God, right smack into their lap, and she smiled and said, "Welcome home." So hang in there. It's going to be a rough ride, but it's a good ride.
I like you use she.
Yes, yes. Yeah. And you're right. It all ends up on the table.
It does.
You use the word certainty, and I listened to another interview that you did, and you had such an interesting way of talking about the stages of faith. And in the deconstruction zone community, and I love that you also have that term that you use. I love it. And we read Brian McLaren's book and talked about the stages of faith and how bittersweet it is that, you know, when we move into another stage and we leave behind people who we love and care for. And for us, for our experience, we look back with some tenderness there because that's where we came from and we understand that stage. And we once belonged there, but we no longer do. And they look at us and say, well, you no longer belong here and you're lost. That way of rethinking faith and certainty, and the fact that you can't have faith if you want certainty. Like, faith is the thing that is uncertain. It's all about uncertainty. But you talked about the scale of 1 to 10 and how you're moving toward curiosity away from certainty, and how no matter where you get on the scale of 1 to 10, you're always looking back and have that kind of that bittersweet sense of belonging and compassion. How did just explain that a little bit if you could? I hope you remember that.
You know, I think Peggy Campolo, the wife of Tony Campolo and a dear mentor in my life, Peggy was doing LGBTQ inclusion work back in the 80s.
Oh, wow.
As someone in the evangelical world. She was way ahead of the game. But when I first began this work, she told me, she said, Stan, just remember, she said, none of us are at a 10. And probably the real metric is infinity. But in terms of spiritual development, religious ideology, if there is a scale from 0 to 10, and she said, and you're at an 8 on the idea of LGBTQ inclusion, someone else is at a 2. She said, remember that 2 is not a contradiction of 8, mathematically or ideologically in the metaphor. I mean, think about it. 2 is a part of 8. And she said, now, what happens a lot is you get with someone who is backwards in this idea, which is what Paul called the weaker brother, the weaker sister, the one who thinks they can't eat particular things because they've been offered to an idol. So they have more rules, but Paul didn't call them the stronger sibling. They're actually the weaker one because they have a weak conscience and they're fearful of some things they don't need to be fearful of. But Peggy said the real problem is in this interaction, if you're at an 8 and they're at a 2, just know they think they're at an 8 and you're at a 2. And they're as convinced of that, that way of looking at the numbers as you are your way. And she said, so the real problem is the false 6. It's the 6 that we disagree on between us. And she said, if you will remember, this is the obligation of the stronger sibling, to have compassion for the one that's still at 2 in this idea. Remember when you were at 2, Don't think about the false six. Don't think about the contradictions. Remember the two that is a part of the eight. Remember the language of two and speak the language of two and build a bridge. Let them know that there's common things still. That's what people, Marcia, had to see when they would see me singing hymns with my mom. You know, they wanted me to be a yellow-eyed, sulfurous breath demon, but here's this person who loves his mother and is singing these hymns, and I wasn't doing it in contradiction. That was still a part of me. She and
Yeah.
I didn't disagree about everything. There were some things that we still shared. Deconstruction for me has not meant that everything I once believed is gone. There are some things that I took off the shelf that I have very happily said, yeah, that still works for me. My dad and I agree on some things.
Yeah.
But she said, remember the language of two, identify there, meet them in mutuality, and then remember the language of three. Because you didn't jump from 2 to 5 or from 2 to 8, you moved from 2 to 3. Remember the language of three that is accessible to the two. And when you are able to help them move from 2 to 3, celebrate like it's 8, because in ways it is, because they have just developed the spiritual muscle to move.
Mm.
And the 2 to 3 will be a wonderful win for them. Have an IEP, an individual educational plan with every person. Judge and assess relative to capacity and celebrate the wins. And then before too long, 3 will be able to entertain the language of 4. And that has been so helpful for
Yeah.
me through the years to even be humble about my eightness. I mean, who knows? This is like two parents who are eminent MIT professors in astrophysics listening to their 4-year-old be incredulous with their 3-year-old about the color green. You know, it's like God is watching us argue and act like we're so erudite and wise. I'm telling you, the big lines for me these days are not between conservative and liberal or traditional and progressive. More and more, the lines are between kind and unkind, loving and unloving. And I have every reason to be loving toward those that are lagging behind on these things. I don't expect queer people to have the same level of patience that I have. They have suffered indiscriminately far more than I have. So I'm not sending abused people back into abusive settings.
Yeah.
But I can work with the perpetrators because I have great sympathy for them because I once was them.
Yeah. Well, I know we need to wrap this up here, but with your work, actually working one on one with so many families as they're navigating maybe their child or that has come out as part of the LGBTQ community, and you go in and you work personally with these people. So I know you have story after story, but can you just talk about the why this is so important that we figure out this issue?
Well, this issue amongst many issues, I really do believe, Marcia, at the core of my being, and this is going to sound probably too esoteric, but I can't tell you how much I truly believe that this is an enchanted universe. I have a sense that something or someone is beneath all of this, and it's a gift. And I don't think my old conceptions of God are less than whoever and whatever that is. I think they were the rudimentary juvenile ways of pointing to something that wasn't less than them, but was even more than them. I am definitively a second naivete person who has recaptured the awe and the wonder of first naivete without the fundamentalism and demand of orthodoxy. I've been able to move through the critical, sophisticated stage. You remember Joni Mitchell's song, Both Sides Now?
Oh yeah, love it.
It's a beautiful song about first naivete and then criticism and then post critical thought or second naivete. First naivete, pre critical thought, moons and Junes and Ferris wheels, the dizzy dancing way that you feel when every fairy tale comes true. I've looked at love that way. Criticism, sophistication, the dry desert of loss of faith, loss of enchantment. But now it's just another show. You leave them laughing when you go. And if you care, don't let them know. Don't give yourself away. But then the resolve of second naivete. I've looked at love from both sides, from the pre-critical to the critical and cynical. I've looked at love from both sides now, from give and take, and still somehow it's love's illusions. I recall I really don't know love at all. And I have come to, I've moved through that phase where I knew Christianity was the deal, and I knew we were the only ones, and I knew we were going to end up in heaven, though most people ended up in hell. And I held all of that so sacrosanct, and then it crumbled and I lost it. I buried Jesus. And but second naivete is the stuff of Mary Magdalene on Saturday saying, I can't walk away completely from this. I mean, when the other disciples went back to the net, she hung around on that Saturday and she showed up that Sunday morning, not because she believed in a resurrection, but because she said, he may not have been who I thought he was, but it doesn't mean he was nothing. And it doesn't deserve to stink, and it doesn't deserve to decay. It deserves my gratitude as I let it go. And in her letting go and doing that very decent, loving thing of just releasing the Jesus who had died, he came back to her. And the amazing thing is, and this has been my journey, when he comes back, he always comes back and is immediately unrecognizable because my mind is expanded. He comes back. Not only, Stacy, did he come back and she not recognize him, she even cocked her head sideways and said, matter of fact, you might be the gardener who stole him.
Yeah.
Every time the new Christ, the new vision of the divine, the new spiritual understanding comes to me, not only do I not recognize it, I even see it as the heretical blame for the loss of the old one. And she looked at Jesus and said, you know what? You might have even stolen him. And he could have wryly looked back at her and said, kind of I did. Because it's always the new Christ that's stealing the old Christ. And so I so believe all of that, that I want that for all humans. I just think that to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, and to love ourselves as we are loved by that underpinning of the divine. If humans could get there, I play on one field of continually of LGBTQ inclusion, and then the broader field of trying to get Christians to let go of their exclusive mindset, to be like Jesus as a baby. As a baby, he lay in his manger and he showed us this is the way you relate to people from another religion. The wise men, who were probably Zoroastrian priests, he received gifts from them and let them go back to their home unconverted. That's what you do with other religions. You allow them to bless you and go home to theirs. Why do they need to convert? Their religion just caused them to travel 1,000 miles to give you gifts and bless you and not try to convert you. That's where I think religion has to go. And LGBTQ inclusion gives me just a place to scratch the surface of that. And I think that would be healing for our world. And so, yeah, beneath LGBTQ inclusion is something a whole lot broader, a vision a whole lot deeper. And that is that all of us would see every human being born as a beloved child of God. We are one another's. But as long as we look at people and think human beings are born and the majority of them are going to be tortured forever, while a small minority somehow deserve an opulent eternal lifestyle with mansions fronting golden streets. If we think the God who created all of this will be satisfied with eternity playing out with a large proletariat of people tortured forever in extreme deprivation, while just a minority few get to live in opulence and wealth, why wouldn't we play that same thing out here? Thy kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven. That's exactly what exclusivistic religion is doing. We think that's who God is, so that's what we're doing here. We've got to change our minds about God and who's in and who's out. And so that's why I do what I do. And I'm very passionate about it. And probably my passion is deeply rooted in my own suffering, because those ideas caused me enormous suffering in my
Mhm.
life. And this is not countertransference as a counselor, but it probably comes close to that. It is very healing for me to help others on this same journey of healing that I'm on. Because frankly, as much as I've said everything that I've said and deeply believe it, I still carry some of the angst and the torturous ideas and the emotional feel of those things in the cells of my being that are deeper than intellect can touch. I've done a lot of somatic work, a lot of internal family system, EMDR, brain spotting, trying to get down to that 4 and 5 year old who first believed all of this stuff. So I know the damage of it, and it's helpful to me to help others. So that's the story of my life these days.
It's beautiful. And you made me cry again. See, every
Oh,
time you
sorry
speak.
about that.
Think of it as a baptism.
Yeah,
Mm,
a little
yeah.
baptism. Stan Mitchell, thank you so much for
Oh,
joining us and for the work that you do, and yeah, for just being you. You're such a great guy, and this conversation has been so great and so helpful. And have
thank
fun out
you.
there in the 109-degree heat of Arizona.
It's just a dry
I
heat. Don't worry
it's
about
just
it.
yeah, that's what I thought until my black hair started boiling in the I got to be careful with the product I put on. It could be inflammatory.
Your
I don't
gel
know.
will go. Whoop.
Yeah.
Oh man, you're
So good being
great.
with y'all.
Great to have you today. Have a great time. I hope to see you soon, friend.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thanks.
And that's it for another episode of the Fresh Start Podcast. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you back here in a couple of weeks. Until then, y'all be well. This episode has been brought to you by God and My Girlfriend's Ministries. If you're looking for a faith-based community where everyone is accepted, all beliefs are welcome, and no judgment, check out godandmygirlfriendsministries.org, where you can find more information about our book clubs, both online and in person, upcoming retreats, and all the events in your area. You can also find out about one of our favorite things that we do, our Single Moms Christmas Blessing Ministry. So go check out godandmygirlfriendsministries.org. We would love to have you a part of our community.